Welcome to the Finding Purpose podcast. My name is Adam. I am your host, and I am so happy to have my friend Dr. Tian Dayton here on the show. Tian, I met in New York City. She was doing a workshop with Silver Bell Coaching, and I immediately was just kind of enamored by her approach. She is a senior fellow at the Meadows. She is the author of 15 books including the Soulful Journey of Recovery, the ACOA Trauma Syndrome, and Emotional Sobriety, which she was so gracious to gift me that day when we met in New York City. And, among her many accomplishments, she has a master's in educational psychology and a Ph.D. in clinical psychology, and is a board certified trainer in psychodrama, sociometry, and group psychotherapy. I had the honor of um, participating in a sociometric training workshop that she ran, and I immediately had to reach out to her afterwards and pick her brain and just learn more about her. So it is an extreme privilege to introduce you, Dr. Dayton, and I'm so honored to have you.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
So it's funny because we've connected a couple of times throughout the last several months,
Mhm.
and I know you have such a rigorous schedule. You were traveling a lot, but I really wanted to get to know your journey to what you're doing now. I mean, I think what you're doing now is changing so many lives, and a lot of the folks who um, do such powerful work, you have a story also, and that's really, really what interests me.
Well, see, I'm winding back to my story. I my story is this. I'm a child of an alcoholic. I married 50 years ago, the child of an alcoholic, and we figured out, I would say, within a few years, that something about each of us was reliving our past.
Mm.
In other words, we were carrying, well, I'll tell you actually the moment. We lived in the Poconos. We were part of a an ashram, actually, in our 20s. And we had our daughter. And I I realized we were visiting my husband's mother, who was a practicing alcoholic. And my husband was working in the city at that moment, temporarily. And I I realized that there was you know what, we just went dark. Did you see this? Oh,
Mhm.
sorry. That was on my end for some reason. Okay. Let me reel it back a little.
Okay.
So, um, I realized that I was, taking care of our daughter with my alcoholic mother-in-law, and my husband was out during the day. And I just felt like the two of us were living in a kind of a crazy circumstance. So I picked up my daughter, went back to our home while my husband finished working in the city, and read Vern Johnson's book, I'll Quit Tomorrow. There was no such thing as adult children of alcoholics movement at the time. That didn't exist. So the closest I could get to figuring out what was going on with my mother-in-law and so forth was to pick up this book and learn more about the disease of alcoholism. And in doing that, I realized through his really candid and excellent writing that my husband and I were living out something he described as dry drunk behaviors. That if an addict does not get recovery, embrace 12 step and so forth, they white knuckle it, and they have all these behaviors that are dry drunk without treatment. And I thought, we're doing something like this, so we must have been really impacted by growing up the way we did. And I started working the steps for myself. I looked at, I am the first step, and I am powerless over having grown up with addiction. I understood that, and I just began working the steps. It was different from Al-Anon because Al-Anon at that time was really for the enabler, the spouse of the alcoholic. So I started on my own, and then I found meetings that helped. But it was in 1980 when the ACOA movement really started, and I went to that first conference in Orlando, that the connection was made for me and my husband. We went together. We went actually with my mother, and we saw clearly, who we were, and we now had a name. So the work I have done is really with ACOAs and then addicts.
So like when you are, this community is being born, what do you feel were like the underlying feelings that you all had in common? And um, obviously you're acknowledging that, hey, listen, this is how my parents chose to live deeply impacted me. What was like some common themes that folks who are adult children of alcoholics feel?
I'm working on a book on adult children of addicts, so I can rattle them off. I'll start telling what woke me up.
Okay.
My husband and I were having a fight, and I knew that we were shadowboxing with ghosts. I knew that we were angry at something that wasn't in the room with us. It wasn't each other. I just saw a split screen for a moment, and I knew that the anger we were feeling was not appropriate to whatever it was we were arguing about. It
Mm.
was something else. And the hurt we were feeling was about more than the argument we were having. We were carrying something. We had just been at his mother's, and we were carrying a distress, an inner distress that we didn't know what to do with. My father, the alcoholic in my life, had died, and my parents divorced at a younger age. So I had more years without alcoholism. My mother was in Al-Anon. I had a lot of Al-Anon in my mind, and I had, dipped into Alateen. So I had some of the language and some of the understanding, which I think really helped. My husband didn't have that at the time. So I could see something coming toward me because we'd just been with his mother that got stirred up there.
Mm.
And I knew it didn't belong at me. And I could see my own overreaction to what was coming toward me. This was the true beginning. Now, how ACOAs carry what I now would call complex post-traumatic stress. The book I wrote, the ACOA Trauma Syndrome, was to make the connection between growing up with addiction and complex, a post-traumatic stress disorder, now called complex PTSD, where the experience, the feelings you're experiencing, the symptoms, the syndromes you're experiencing come as a post-traumatic disorder. In other words, you might seem fine
Mm.
for years, but when you get into a marriage, when you start having children, all of the experiences you had as a small child, all of those feelings that got set up within the home get stirred up and triggered when you try to set up your own home as an adult. They can be dormant, they can be latent for a long time, which makes you think you got out okay.
Yeah.
But when you try to recreate the intimate relationships, the feelings of dependency, vulnerability kick up all the unresolved stuff. Now, the laundry list is something like depression, anxiety, trouble with boundaries, emotional dysregulation, overreactions. That would be the laundry list. The actual visceral experience is You can't find your way out of a conflict with your spouse. You start talking to your past parents and saying to your spouse all the stuff you couldn't say to them, but you don't know you're doing that. Does
Yeah,
that
I
help?
mean, yeah, that's awesome. And like one of the things that you said is shadow boxing with ghosts.
Yeah.
And that's like so powerful. Like, because I can put myself in places now where like I think about like previous arguments or previous escalations I've had with people that I love, and I'm like, I never really was mad at them. Like what they did wasn't something that was warranted me getting as hyped up or angry about the situation. There's an underlying thing that was really just trying to emerge. And yeah, that's awesome. And then the other thing that you said was a completely dysregulation of emotions. And it's funny because one of the things that I consciously try to work on now is emotional regulation, and I'm not there yet. Like I can regulate my emotions pretty well, but sometimes I find that when I'm focusing on regulating my emotions, I'm also suppressing them. And then it's kind of the same thing where as time progresses, those suppressed emotions that I'm not really handling, I'm just like ignoring and pushing down. um then they come up to the bubble and then there is a blowout. That recently actually happened with a loved one where it's like there was a lot in, kind of um that I've been wanting to say and that I was kind of holding in, and just kind of where you just don't want to rock the boat, so you're just not really going to say how you feel because I kind of spewed it out, and then I realized that's what I was doing. Like if I had kind of like let it go incrementally whenever the inappropriate time had come, maybe the conversation would have developed, over.
Adam, if
Yeah.
you want this to be useful to your viewers, we're going to need to get more specific because I can help you understand what was going on, but not if I don't know who the loved one is and all of that. So what do you want to do with this actually?
Ooh, love that. Well, yeah, I was, I've been in a relationship for quite a while with my girlfriend Sarah, and we have, there's a lot that I've done throughout my using that, you know, obviously affected her. And, we're having a conversation about like what the future holds and what our plans were. And we were at a disagreement. And for me, um, you know, I know that like, like any alcoholic, I have an ego and I have these things and I do my best to not lead with that. And I let my ego come out and I was like, listen, I'm in the place where I know what we need to do. This is what needs to get done. And, she's just not there yet, and she's still processing a lot and she's in a place where she wants to she's proceeding with caution because she's seen me fail her so many times. And I get that. I do get that, but in the moment it was very frustrating because I look at it as I selfishly look at it as I'm clear-headed, my head is in the right place, and now I want to move forward, and I want to move forward at my pace. And my pace is I can't impose my pace on other people. And I think that's uh
Talking about you're talking about a whole bunch of stuff, and if you want to, this will turn this into an analysis of you, or we can talk about the issues, or I can weave them together. But that's what this is turning into. Do you
that's
want it to
fine.
do that?
Whatever you want to do.
Well, no, it's what you seem to be wanting to do.
Well,
I
I just wanted to bring it that the reason why I thought about that is because you were talking about the emotional regulation, and then you were talking about the shadow boxing with ghosts. There is something that I'm really upset about. That it's not her. And I'm having trouble to really identifying it.
so
Um,
okay. So I worked with you a little bit that day. Do you want me
yeah,
to harken back to that? Do you want to do this?
yeah, sure.
Okay. So do I recall there was parental addiction in your history?
There was no parental addiction, but there was parental narcissism, I would say. There was the lie about me being adopted, which I really had to confront when we did that the timeline drill, where I was able to talk to um my younger self, and then my younger self was able to respond to my 37-year-old self. So that was
Here's the part that's interesting. You couldn't find your younger self, if you recall that. And that was where the work was so fascinating. Because initially, when you were in the role of your younger self, you were lost. And this is what happens to children with childhood trauma. Because of and the lying about your being adopted would constitute childhood trauma. And I can't bring back, there was more in the history of your parents, but I can't quite, maybe narcissism, I can't quite remember it. But what I do remember was how profoundly traumatic that was for you around the age of 12 to find out. Am I remembering
we
correctly?
found out when we were 12.
So then you started acting out and using
Yeah.
right at that time. Well, there's the connection between trauma and addiction, right?
Hmm.
It's so painful to find out that kind of thing about your past. Can you imagine reordering your psyche to say, you mean I'm not your blood child and you've been what, lying to me? And where are my parents? And all of the things that would have gone through your mind that nobody was addressing straight up.
Hmm.
So what ended up happening was you had to reach out for self-medication, right? You had to make that pain go away somehow. And so you got all that done with drugs and alcohol. But the interesting thing when you were on the timeline is you lost those years. And because because of the trauma and the way the brain processes trauma and the thinking mind shutting down, so you weren't making me sense of everything that was happening. Plus the addiction, you were losing time.
Yeah.
Uh, when you were standing on the timeline, it was very obvious that you couldn't remember them. So then we broke it out and let you be that young person having the scene and saying what you never got to say, right? To both your parents, how could you not tell me all the things you never got a chance to say? And then, as I recall, you reversed roles with both your parents.
Hmm.
And as I recall, you gained a lot of understanding about why they might have kept that to themselves. Not that it was right or wrong, but you were a compassionate guy and you did love them and you felt loved by them. And so you had all that to draw on. And then if I don't know if you recall when you reversed back to being on the timeline, you remembered everything.
Yeah.
That once we just removed that block in your sane self today, it all cleared up. And that is the remarkable thing about psychodrama. And it's the remarkable thing about these processes I've developed for RTRS, relational trauma repair sociometrics, is that the timeline work can actually let you say what you needed to say then but couldn't. That is creating psychic trauma for you. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
And
you
confusion.
one of the most fascinating things about that exercise for me was, you led by asking, how old do you feel emotionally?
Oh, did
And
I?
yeah, and I picked like, 12, 13, and that's when you asked what happened then. And then I went into the story about finding out that we were adopted, and then we walked through it. And then towards the latter end of it, um you had me at 26 when I was talking to my mother on her deathbed. And and I was getting, and because I think I had shared that, me and her had gotten closure, but I think I still held some feelings. And you're like, all right, well, let's go to 26 and let's talk to your mother. And we had that dialogue where I was playing both roles. And then at the end of it, you asked me, so like now how old would you say that you feel emotionally? And I did feel completely different. It was very transformational, where I was like, yeah, like I feel like 25, 26 now. And it's because um, I was able to just really like put myself in the moment of when these events were happening, and something that I never even dared to do on my own because it's
Yeah.
scary, you know? And, I think that's where what you do is so amazing because that was scary. And that was also in a room full of a lot of folks who I didn't really know. But, so like, in that point, I was just kind of like, I walked into that exercise being like, okay, I'll be the guinea pig, so, and then as it progressed, I was like, no, you know what? Like, I actually want to take something out of this. So I'm going to pretend nobody's in this room. It's just me, you, and Natasha. And we're going to do this, and and I think that's why in the beginning, it was almost like I didn't remember. I think I was still trying to protect myself a little bit from the room.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Interesting.
and when I finally like something clicked and I was like, you know what? I'm here for a reason. I need to take what I can out of it. And that's when I was really be able to dig in and just kind of ignore the environment around me. And yeah, that was so powerful.
Boy,
Um,
do I wish we had that on video so people could compare that and hear you talk about it and describe it from your side.
yeah.
That's, but I have to say, I usually don't say how old do you feel. I would have said, where do you feel you need to do some work?
Okay. Maybe
So
you might have
that,
said that.
no, but it's interesting that you heard that because that's actually closer to the truth. I just would hesitate to ask it because most people wouldn't know or be able to answer it anyway. But what does happen is you stop sort of growing with trauma, and certainly with addiction. It's one of the things they say, you stop at that emotional age when because you lose that maturation. If your feelings are numb and you don't have access to them, you can't mature and grow with with the understanding you gain from processing your feelings. So you don't mature in the same way you would if you had access to your emotions. But it's not only addiction that does that, it's trauma also, because what really hurts us is what we shove to the bottom. So that people who grew up with addiction or parental trauma for some reason, um, in the home, can lose access to the feelings they need in order to become more mature people. And then it comes out later in these relationships. But in your case, you were also an addict. So it comes, I mean, I don't think we need to go into the whys and wherefores because
Yeah.
your partner isn't here. So
Yeah.
we,
No,
yeah.
totally. Um, when you talk about trauma, why, I mean, I understand why it's so difficult for folks to really face it. Um, and I think that like trauma can be defined differently by each, like it's subjective to your experience. So, um, what do you think society now, where when it comes to trauma, like why do you think it like so many people are closed off to actually facing their own trauma?
See, because I'm as old as I am, I see it from the opposite side. To me, there is so much openness in society to calling something trauma because I grew up in the era where trauma just plain didn't exist. Only soldiers had trauma, or maybe somebody who'd been, you know, raped at gunpoint, but
Mhm.
other people just needed to kind of get over it. So say more about who you're talking about population wise and what you're thinking, because we see it differently because of our ages.
Sometimes I feel that when I people let address their trauma in a way where it's not to heal but to attract attention, and
Hmm.
I think that when um I see that and it's advertised that way, it closes off other people from, especially with the exposure, obviously, of the social media, everything is accessible. It closes other people who are in a lot of pain from navigating their story because it's almost like this trauma comparison game. And they're like, okay, like I didn't experience what they did on their level. So, like my story isn't worth telling. And, I really empathize with those folks because, at the end of the day, your story is your story. And if there's pain in your story, regardless of what it is compared to others who are publicly sharing, traumatic stories and, doing it for likes and doing it for, whatever motivating reasons they have, um, that doesn't mean that you should stay quiet. That doesn't mean that you should seek help. That doesn't mean, like your story matters also. So while you're right, like the actual trauma and addressing it from, when you were growing up until now, absolutely. It is very much in the public forum and it's more acceptable, but I think it's a good thing and a bad thing because it also like the comparison game is at full throttle nowadays. And when
Yeah.
people are comparing trauma stories, um, like I hate when I because I sit down with a lot of folks. I'm working with a company where we're talking about women on their fertility journey, and like some women are very timid to come up and be like, "This is my story. Does it matter?" And I'm like, "Of course it matters. That's what you went through."
Yeah.
So like that's kind of where I was going with that. Where yeah, it's acceptable, but I with that whole comparison game going on, I think it's also dangerous because like one of the things in recovery is you have to be honest with your story, you
Mhm.
know, and I can't I'm not gonna pass judgment on anyone whether they're being honest with their story or not, but like like that's something that had helped me, and like, I just think that many folks feel that their story doesn't matter because there's such an influx of other stories.
I mean, it's interesting what you say because social media has created a crisis of its own, and we're just beginning to untangle this crisis. It's so siloed that all of the politics have become siloed, and even people's thinking and identities are becoming siloed. And I think the superficiality of social media is dangerous because you can feel like you've shared, you can feel like you have friends, you can feel like you have a community, but then you click a button and nobody's there, you know? So you're steeped in that. And I think that it's a subject that you couldn't say enough about. So you're seeing things that I don't see. But although it's very easy for me to follow, to pick up on what you say, because I've lived with the progression of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've seen the I've seen the how trauma, then I think that's an American thing too, that we get a hold of something and then we just swirl it around until it's like we beat it till it's like a dead horse. And trauma is a subject like that. Now, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for years. So people are now very open to talking, to reading, to understanding more about trauma. But that doesn't mean people understand it. Or that doesn't mean people aren't using it the way you're describing it. But social media competes with everything, right?
Yeah.
Everything from trauma to fingernails to, you know,
Yeah. It's funny because like when I started telling my story and I started doing it in public forums and um I was really fearful at first, and I think that was really at a period where like I held a lot of shame with my story still. So like actually like going out and like speaking honestly and candidly about like things that I did, what I had been through, how it had affected me. Yeah, there was a lot of fear attached to that initially, and but I really now if I really identify that fear and dig deep, it was really shame. But then what I do understand like when you go and do it and the value that I got the most out of it was when people would come up to me afterwards and they would be like, I went through something similar, you know? or I'm adopted too, or like my father was an alcoholic, and like those kind of, like because like then I would be like, all right, let's have a conversation, me and you, one on one, and I'd love to hear, what you've been going through. And that was what really forged meaningful like bonds, like friendships that I've never had before when I was using and drinking, because like those were very surface level, quid pro quo kind of transactional relationships, like fun for fun, instant gratification. That's it.
Mhm.
And now like the relationships that I find, yeah, comes with that vulnerability. And um, I was in a meeting the other day and the subject was fear. And it was a beginners meeting and there was like kids in there, and they're like 17, 18, 19, just trying to do the right thing, not knowing where they are. And I was like, like they were talking about like, oh, I'm afraid of like, you know, having to never drink again. I'm afraid of blah, blah, blah. I'm afraid of blah, blah. And a lot of the things that they're afraid of were like material things or things that like, I now know that I once feared and know that like I don't need to be scared of that right now. But
Mhm.
what I told them, now that, I've been on this journey, one of my biggest fears in the beginning was vulnerability. I was afraid of really just opening up, be like, a lot of people say they're an open book, but are they? Like, and that's the thing, like being that open book and just like putting everything out there. And I told them, I was like, listen, in this room, nothing you say is going to shock anybody. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's like such a beauty of the AA community where, like you can go there and just put everything out there. And there's gonna be someone sitting next to you who's like, yeah, I used to do that all the time. Like,
And if you look at that from a clinic through a clinical lens, that I wish I wish people would just walk into 12-step rooms and see the miracles that happen and get the trauma treatment they need. And I don't care what they're calling it, because you throw a dollar in the basket and it is profound healing for these reasons. There is a limbic resonance. Your limbic system is what becomes dysregulated through trauma, right? In order to re-regulate your limbic system, you need new experiences that are regulating. It's not going to happen because you think the right thought or you read the right book. You need the actual physiological experience of being with people in a different way. So there is a resonance that happens among people who are sitting in an open, listening, sharing mode where there are rules so that nobody's going to take over, so that nobody's going to stand up and scream, so that the atmosphere stays stable and safe. Then you can start to trust opening up again. You're not going to open up again if you can't trust the room. So people learn to trust the room. And if they keep going and keep sharing and keep listening, they will get in touch with themselves, which is what shuts down in trauma. People freeze inside, they shut down their feelings, all of that. So these feelings get warmed up in the 12-step room because you're listening. And through listening, you're identifying, and then your emotional self starts going, oh, wow. So maybe you have some shaky feeling inside. Maybe your heart starts to pound a little, your head starts to tighten up, your shoulders go up. But okay, I'm in a safe room. Maybe I can talk for those 3 minutes. That could be mine. Maybe I'll share a little piece of my story. And then I will be done because somebody's going to go like that.
hmm,
So that too will make me feel safe because they won't let me take over the room and they won't let anybody else take over the room. All of these are part of creating safety. Then as you get in touch with your own feelings, we're talking year one, right?
hmm,
People need to do this for years. They're listening without blowing up, without pounding the floor, without jumping up and leaving the room, without exploding and raging. They're learning to listen, which is containment of a sort. You're learning to listen and tolerate the feelings that listening to charged material that other people are sharing is bringing up in you. But so then you're also learning to regulate your feelings. So we're getting in touch with our own feelings. We're translating them into words and through that language, elevating them to a conscious level. So I can self-reflect and I can reflect in a group. I can listen and reflect. I can hear myself and reflect. I can think and reflect. I can make new sense of old feelings. All of this is really what heals trauma. I hear people, I train a lot of therapists. They say things like, do you tell people you're going to do trauma treatment? And I'm just saying, I wouldn't if I were you. You're just going to scare your poor patients. And what you want to do is have an open, easy atmosphere so that people don't freeze up. And by the way, you can't the whole notion of trauma is that you can't just tell your trauma story. And that's not what heals your trauma story. The narrative is not the friend of the trauma story, because the parts of the brain and body that store trauma are not accessible with words. The thinking mind, the prefrontal cortex, where you use words and think, that's shut down during trauma. It's pushed down. We're not supposed to think of getting out of the way of a charging elephant. We're supposed to fight and flight, flee for safety, or stand and defend ourselves, or freeze. So they'll think we're dead, feign death. That all means that you're not thinking. So that all of this waking up, so that your thinking mind can start to make sense of your limbic world. By your limbic world, I mean all of your emotions. The limbic world, the limbic system processes emotions and collects sense memories. So trauma, because the limbic, during moments of trauma, the limbic world is on high alert, right? Fight, flight. Your limbic world is doing this. Your thinking mind is doing this. So you're recording all of the sensory data of the traumatic moment, and you're recording the emotions that are double coded with that data, but no thought. So that's why you can't pull this stuff up. It comes up when you get triggered, what you talked about earlier, when the relationship triggers this.
Yeah.
When people get triggered, they look at the person who's triggering it and thinking, why are you making me feel so horrible? Well, that's not what's going on. The content that's getting triggered is very likely very unconscious, very unresolved, very big and unregulated. So if you just project it at the person triggering it and make it about them, this relationship is in real trouble from the get-go, because it might be 30% about them, but the other 70 might be just historical stuff. And until you work out the historical antecedents, till you understand what you're carrying around, you're not going to be able to know which parts about the current relationship, which parts about the past. So this is at the core of trauma treatment. And if you really want to get through this stuff, the rooms are an incredible resource. But this is what needs to happen in trauma treatment. You have to separate the past from the present.
Yeah.
But that time, and it never ends. It never ends. I've been married 50 years. It never ends, because life keeps offering up. Maybe it's your husband and your kids who trigger you, and you grow so much to being married and partnered. But then we have grandchildren. So now they trigger things. And not only my grandchildren trigger things, but their relationship with their parent, who I raised, trigger things. And I'm thinking, oh no, I did that wrong, or oh, I did that right, or all of this stuff. So this stuff never ends. What you need to develop in recovery is not the right answer or the right insight. That's part of it. You also need to, while you're cleaning out the past, develop a really good and well-maintained set of, I don't like the word tools is so awkward, but the resilience skills, the skills to process feelings as they come up and sort them through in as conscious a way as possible. And for that, what you alluded to a few minutes ago, self-honesty, it's crucial. If you can't be honest. So when you share those stories with the people in the room and you assure them there's nothing you can say here that's going to make anybody else jump up out of their seat and hit you or scream or call you a name, you are creating a community of safety for them in which to heal. You couldn't be doing better trauma healing work So that's why we have to broaden our understanding of trauma, because it doesn't just belong to the experts anymore. And I think first of all, there aren't enough experts to treat it. The world's so traumatized.
Yeah.
Secondly, a lot of experts are traumatized too. So, hey, you know, and because it's not all about the right insight. It's not all about, if I feel the sorriest for people who wait for their 50-minute appointment to do their trauma work. This is so sad and sorrowful to me. You need a whole network of support. 12-step rooms are part of it. Also, you need to change the way you live. You
Yep.
need to get the substances. You need to sober up on all the substances. You need to add exercise to your life so that you're using the medicine box inside of you to regulate emotions instead of food or sex or drugs or alcohol. You need to deep breathe. You need to do self-soothe. You need to learn how to self-soothe without substances. And you need friends, you need relationships. There's so many things that are part of recovery and
Yeah,
trauma.
one of the things that I like to say is connection is the opposite of addiction. And
Yeah.
for me, that's proven very true where, you were talking about like being in meetings, and it's so funny because like I have like a pretty nice network of different folks, but that's when I feel the safest. That's when I'm like, I'm here with my people.
Mm.
And one of the things, that I think is directly related to the work that you do is recently I've been hearing a lot of shares about folks who are adult children of alcoholics who are in the rooms, and
Mm.
and a lot of that their parents were in recovery, and they were like, all right, like I was raised in these rooms. That's how I found them. But they still had to kind of navigate their own
I have
journey
a really good,
before
I have
going back to them.
much to say about that whenever you're ready.
Yeah, no, go. I mean, because like I'm fascinated
So
by it. I just want to say one other
this
thing
is
is
where I
because like
specialize.
lately I've been identifying a lot of characteristics in myself that I got from my father. And it's really annoying. It's to just like it's really annoying to see it because like like you a lot of people grow up and they're like I don't want to be like my parents, and but I can identify them now. And then like I sit in these rooms and they're like, oh, like my I was raised in this room, my parent was an alcoholic, but yet I didn't find it right away. um so maybe talk about that relationship, and you said you
What I
had a lot to say about it, so
I mean, here's what I heard you say, and I might have heard you incorrectly. I thought you were saying they were raised by parents who were in recovery or parents who were ACOAs.
there are ACOAs who found recovery, and
These are ACOAs who found recovery. The in
yeah.
other in other words, these aren't people who were raised by untreated ACOAs. They were raised by addicts.
They're raised by addicts. Some of their parents did find the rooms,
Yeah.
and some of them didn't. But I've been hearing a lot of like I've been hearing like a lot of folks talk about their parents' alcoholic journey. And some of them be like, all right, they got sober when I was 10, and that's how I discovered AA really at a young age. But then I went out, and despite the things that I might have heard at a tender age when my parents used to bring me to meetings, I went out and had to go explore and have my, alcoholic journey as well before I decided to join them in the rooms. And
Well, it's not surprising because
yeah.
10 years old is, the Jesuit who said, give me your child till they're 7 and then they'll be mine for life. So think of the alcoholic who's saying, give me my child till I'm 7 or 10. And then that's the disease of alcoholism, right?
Mhm.
If your parent doesn't get sober, here's the problem with that. Your parent feels sober and they think, hey, wait a minute, you got a sober parent most of your years. Well, the child really didn't. The child got a using parent and then a newly recovered parent who felt so much better because they were sober, but they were still working their issues like crazy, right?
Mhm.
And the parent, when that's a very unique little population because they want to go back to their parent and say, this is what you did to me, with me, at me. But their parent, first of all, may not remember that because they were using during that time. And second of all, they want to say, I want credit for my recovery. I really was a good parent. So that's a really double pain for that kid because they really need the help just as much as their parent did. If they had an addict parent until they were even 6, they had an addict parent. Until they were 3, they had an addict parent. Their psyche remembers that. Their body remembers that. The children are the neediest when they're the smallest.
Yeah.
And they are looking to their parents for everything. So if the parent is addicted, they may not remember what they didn't do, but the child remembers it, even though they can't recall it. J.L. Moreno, who created Psychodrama, has a saying, the body remembers what the mind forgets. And that's what we're treating in Psychodrama. We are treating the body that remembers in Psychodrama. And that's why you have to be so astute when you're doing Psychodrama, so that as the body remembers, you can stay with the body and what it's remembering and not think that the answer is getting the right psychodrama to happen. The answer is in helping the protagonist to tolerate what is coming up in their body and making slow sense of it. And it's why I like to talk to, I also use the timeline to, where you remember, talk to yourself. Because that relationship between the adult self and the child self gets broken too. So the first relationship I want to repair is the one people have with themselves, with their own inner being. And so there are categories of being ACOA. This is how complex it all is. Some kids grew up with addict parents till they were a certain age. Some kids grew up with addict parents their whole life. Some grew up, and this is the category that fascinates me, even currently a lot, is the group that grows up with ACA parents who just never got treatment. I think that I'm writing about that now. And I think we are so under researched in this area, but I have so much I'm doing to research that area, because if you're an ACOA and you never get treatment, all of that pain, all of that gaslighting, all of that distorted thinking that has now walled off with these defenses and what we call cognitive biases that make you feel, I don't need any treatment. I'm fine, and don't talk to me about that. And that's who raises those children. So you're almost better off being a kid with an alcoholic parent, because at least you can say you're an alcoholic and hope that parent sobers up eventually. But the ACOA goes through a parental addiction sober. So the defenses, they don't medicate the pain they're in. So the way they medicate it is through becoming very defensive and walled off, or moving into another addiction. Food, sexual addiction, internet addiction, work addiction. Starting very young, being perfect, starting very young, being the family hero, restoring dignity to the family. In other words, I can work hard, I can get more perfect, and no one will know how much pain I'm in, and neither will I. And my family, they won't ask questions about. So this is very complex, and it's why the intersection of complex trauma, complex PTSD, and growing up with addiction and being raised by ACOAs is like, and we need to untangle it and start to learn about the contorted, twisted thinking that we develop growing up with addiction and pass on in our partnerships and parenting if we don't sort it out. And that's more subtle. But it's more subtle, but it's at least as destructive to children.
Yeah, and I think that really can be addressed towards like any trauma. And thinking about my own family, like my mother, she never, saw a therapist. My father, doesn't really believe in therapy, and they're both old country. My dad's from India. He was the only person who came to this country from his family, and he had a chip on his shoulder that I'm gonna work really hard. And I think he blocked out the fact that he left everybody in India and just kind of just focused. And yeah, he became addicted to work and career and whatnot. And on my mom's side, my mom's father left in the night from Iran, fleeing political and religious persecution, um, and left for like a series of, I think, 2 to 3 years until they finally were reunited with them, um, with him in back when they settled in Philadelphia. And like she never processed that, and it's funny because now that I have a more thorough understanding of trauma and I really look at my parents' stories, they're beautiful stories of just building a life and building a family. Don't get me wrong, but my God, I don't even know if I could have been um, how I would have reacted to some of the huge things that happened early on in their journey that now, you know, I would be like, hey, like I should probably talk to someone about this. I should probably really unpack what I really experienced and come to terms with it. And they never had that opportunity. And I think it was somewhat of like a cultural just like kind of a cultural barrier when it comes to therapy, because you're right. I think in yeah, in those countries it's like you don't talk about it. And then they met, and that's kind of how they ruled the house. My father was a bread earner, she was the wife, and he was the disciplinarian, she was the nurturer, and it was very traditional old country upbringing. And then boom, here comes all American Adam. Like this is how I'm gonna live. So sometimes I think like, man, like I myself was a culture shock to their traditional values and the way they envision this family. Man, I threw a wrench in that. And it's funny when I think about that, because my mom did her best to conform, and she did her best to understand, and she kept my dad at bay. And I think that also like planted like an underlying need for me to constantly be good enough for my dad. Because I also knew he had these old school standards. Um, so it's crazy because like you're talking about adult children about alcoholics, but I think that kind of runs across the board of any significant, whether it's abandonment, whether it's sexual assault, whether it's anything like that that happens at an early age. It's a very similar process. Would you not agree?
I would. And in unpacking your story, that I have to go through about 3 stages because it's so interesting. Um, First, they did a great job with you in spite of everything else, because here
Thank you.
you are. And I have 2 clients. One is Indian, one is Iranian, but they're next generation from your parents. They're more in your age group. Here's how it showed up for them. The Indian client had a father who abandoned them when this baby was 6 months old. They then came to the United States. Well, first her mother came to the United States, and then the grandparents brought her, and they all lived a very different life in the United States from the rather cushy life they had in India, right? Now, she grew up she's very successful. She's happily married, having her children. She had trouble bonding with the first child
Hmm.
because her father had left when she was 6 months. Her mother, I mean, not bonding with the baby. I should qualify that. Not bonding with the baby the first 6 months, but around 6 months, she just had some trouble. And her mother had left around that time. She had been left with her grandparents, who she adored, and her father had left. So her life changed dramatically, right? And everybody's saying, but she's fine and she doesn't remember. Well, she remembers, but it shows up when she's trying to bond with her own 6 month old child and doesn't know why. She wants to get distance. She wants to turn her over to somebody else. She just, her crying makes her nervous, all of this stuff, right? So it shows up, the trigger is very unconscious. And when I explained that to her, because she's so smart, she just went, oh, wow, yeah, right. She put it all together, immediately called her friend from Iran who had fled when she was 3, right? Same story as your mother. I mean, different story, but same
Are they
war.
Jewish?
I don't
Okay.
even know.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know.
Okay. Well,
But
that's why
anyway,
my parents left. That's why they had to leave.
well, then she might be.
Yeah.
I don't know why they had to leave. Probably. Um, but the part that is interesting from the trauma point of view is that her friend had a 3-year-old who she was constantly worried about, right? Now, her 3-year-old had this great American life, very little trauma in her life, great parents, great living situation, all of that. But her mother, when her daughter became 3, started seeing all these, worry, all this worry. And yet she felt crazy because her daughter seemed fine. Well, the child she was worried about was her inner child, triggered by the age of her outer child. And that's where we shipwreck in our relationships, right? So once that I could deliver that piece of information, I mean, I didn't deliver it. My client delivered it to her friend. She just went, oh my God, that's what's going on. And then she could stop being so preoccupied with her child and start doing the healing work she needed to do with her inner child. It's called an age correspondence reaction. It is so accurate. I can't even describe how many situations I've watched. I have another client when she was a baby, her birth weight was 5 pounds. Her mother did not want to take her home. So this is in the 1950s. And in those days, they thought the baby doesn't matter, baby can't remember anyway. Well, little did we know. Anyway, she left her in the hospital. And when she was about, she left her in the hospital an extra 2 or 3 weeks. I said, when she gains some weight, I'll bring her home. She won't remember. So the nurses are calling and saying, about 3 weeks later, maybe you forgot something in the hospital. Oh, right. So she brings the baby home and everything's fine. And she has wonderful care and everybody's Googling over her and, blah, blah, blah. Well, they never associated some of the baby's issues with this early abandonment. But here's the interesting part in terms of an age correspondence reaction. When that baby grew up and became a mother, she had a child who experienced birth trauma. She left him in the hospital. And she knows a lot more. There's a generation more research out there now. She knew better. She left him in the hospital saying, I spent quality time with him every day. I visit for an hour. Now, what 2-week-old baby understands quality time and an hour visit from the mother who they've been inside of, right? So that baby's birth trauma became very exacerbated, did not go away, manifested in all kinds of problems.
Wow.
Wow.
It's
And
funny
she
that
did not make the connection between being left in the hospital herself and leaving her own child in the hospital.
that's crazy.
It's
One of the things that you keep talking about is that inner child, and it's funny because recently I was able to connect with I think I've shared about this on the podcast before, but like I connected with a therapist that used to treat me when I was in my early 20s, and this is when I first really started to get in trouble, and um I asked her what it was like treating me, and she was like, Adam, you were a scared little boy, and I wasn't sure if what we were she was like, every single time that I felt like we were close to a breakthrough, something else would happen, and we would be in just damage control again. So, um,
is
my hopes were
exactly.
that I was planting seeds. My hopes.
Well, I think if you want to go, that's obviously you were planting seeds, good seeds.
Yeah.
But let's unpack that little bit of we'd be in damage control again. Because every time, there it is, every time we get close to breaking through your defensive walls, the unconsciousness and the defensiveness, the lack of experience feeling the pain, right? So what you might have needed, and this is why one-to-one therapy, were you in program at the time, if I may I ask?
Not honestly.
There, that's what I'm saying. You needed more of a safety net.
Yeah.
But she was doing her job.
She was absolutely doing her job. I think about our work together like all the time now.
Yes,
All the
because
time
she was
now.
doing a great job with you. You needed a bigger safety net. When I was in direct service for so many years, I did group therapy, primarily, sometimes one-to-one, but mostly group. And when people would come into my groups, because I do psychodrama and I do intense trauma work, I didn't call it trauma work, but I mean, I did call it trauma work. That's not true, but I just try to not use the word to scare people off. And I would ask people to enter a 12-step program to exercise, develop an exercise program if they didn't already have one, to get a one-to-one therapist, because you never have time in group to process everything that comes up, to modulate, to not use, but often I was treating addicts who were also ACOAs, so they were sober. But if they were not, I asked them to be moderate, right, in their use. And what else did I ask? Smoking is a real issue. I'd ask them to quit or moderate smoking. If they
Cigarettes or
cigarettes,
okay.
pot for sure. Yeah, no pot.
Yeah.
They're not going to grow if they're smoking pot. They're
Yeah.
not going to grow if they're drinking a lot either. But they don't grow much if they're smoking cigarettes. Because every time you have a feeling, and the feeling goes away. And that's why people smoke.
Mm.
Get so addicted because it just is a wonderful medicator. So people who did everything I asked them to do grew like gangbusters. The ones who didn't grow much were the ones who couldn't manage some of those. And then they get into trouble. Like one I'm thinking about right now, there were two people who met each other in group, and it came out during group that, I don't have strict rules in group, like don't talk to somebody outside of group, because so many of my clients see each other in program. So it's just not realistic. But it came out that they were texting, and this is, I'm older, so there was no such thing as texting. So they were texting. And when I examined it just to make sure that there wasn't going on, I said, well, so how many times a day do you text? And I imagined, once or twice a day. Oh, 60. Well, if you're texting back and forth 60 times,
That's a lot.
it's a lot. So something's going on that needs further investigation. What I mean is these groups, when you start hitting pay dirt, when the feelings start kicking up the way they were with your therapist, you need a good container, and you need this abstention from all the stuff that's going to take you away from processing your feelings, so that you can go through the that back to the future experience of processing them and then coming through to the other side, which is, by the way, the shortest way out. But
Mm.
people would avoid it for decades. You
Yeah.
just have to sit with it for a few minutes.
One of the things I wanted to ask you was, like, I know 12 step is something that you firmly believe in and I firmly believe in. And when you get new clients and you recommend 12 step, like, how do you feel? Because I also know there is a stigma when it comes to 12 step where people are
Mm.
intimidated by the God, the higher power component. They look at it as like that's where the problem people go. And for me, now that I see like these like life coaches and mindset coaches, and I look at their curriculums and I'm like, this is textbook 12-step programming.
Yeah, yeah.
This is like, like, you know, understanding what your problems are, understanding you can't do it alone, holding yourself accountable, owning your own shit, and going to the people who you've harmed, and then meditation, it has become then holistic. Cures have become so mainstream now. And then sharing it with others, and I look at it like some coaching programs that like mindset coaches and all these other people are selling, and they're creating these flash reels, and I'm like, you're selling 12-step programming. And I'm blessed that I was like, all right, like I go to that, and then obviously with the component with the sponsor, so then you have the mentorship, and I'm like, that's what it is, so.
It's better. It's better
And
because
it's free, let's be honest,
it,
and it's
it's
free.
free. It's around the corner. It's available virtually. It's available in person, and it's constant and it's relational. And what happens is the rooms become the higher power. The rooms become the good mother. The rooms, because the higher power is just an idea. And people, I always feel so disappointed when people can't get that out of their head. It just, when you're in the rooms, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, the concept of God as you understand him or her could as easily be nature, the universe, my guides, however you want to look at this, it doesn't matter. It's it's the community that heals, it's the program that heals, and it's following the steps that heals, as you pointed out. So why pay a premium for something you get a better version of in the rooms, is
Yeah,
what you're.
and I look at the higher power as like everyone's like good energy, positive vibes only. That's what they're
Yes,
talking about. You know what I
yes.
mean? Like that's what they're talking about. Um,
This,
but I think people, in order to put up that wall, they're like, "Oh, I don't do God," or "I don't do this," and it's like, okay, well, that's you manufacturing a reason not to fully immerse yourself. Um, and another question I wanted to ask you is, so like when I worked in restaurants for years. So like when I go into a restaurant, I'm highly critical, especially a high-end restaurant. I'll be like, that knife's not polished, that that plate is not positioned where it needs to be. Um, and I worked in the gym, so like I'll like be like, that guy's form's terrible. Like I say these things in my head. In
I have
your
to call
trade,
somebody is knocking at my door, and we're over time, so they might I might have to pay attention. Don't go anywhere.
okay.
Hello. Yeah.
So like when I walk into a restaurant, I'm very highly critical, and when I walk into a gym, I'm very highly critical. Given what you do with your skill set and your understanding of people,
Yeah.
and when
I get
you're in
that.
rooms, like I can imagine when you have conversations with people, or you have a really inept way of reading people's body language, like how do you stay within the guardrails of just like not becoming clinical, not being like, oh man, this person has abandonment issues, this person is what you call it, and not like immersing yourself, being like, because I also know you to be like an extremely caring person and wanting to help people. Um, and how do you maintain those guardrails both with your own family and just with people you meet day to day?
Well, that's the $1 million question. With my own family, I maintain them because my kids can't stand it when I'm crossing boundaries. I have grown kids in their 40s who have their own families, and if I uh, cross boundaries, they just very nicely say, "You just crossed my boundary." You know what I mean? They'll tell me. They just tell me.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's good, and that helps me grow. And so I don't worry about it. So I mean, I worry about it with them, but I definitely worry about it with them. And if I cross them in a way that's bad for them, I feel very bad. And with my grandchildren too, by the way.
Mhm.
Um, but I will apologize. I'll say, did I cross it? I'll ask them, and they'll give me a different answer depending on where they are in their own development. What might have felt like a boundary crossing when they were in their 30s, now they look back and it was no big deal in their 40s. So, it's everything changes. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, you cannot step twice into the same river. Everything's always changing. So is trauma recovery, because situations change all the time. But in my normal life, for example, we just had dinner with friends. I know which ones have a problem with alcohol or something like that. And that's where I will feel very sad. But like very sad, I mean, I wish I could help that person. They're such a lovely person. When I've tried, friends, people, it's very tricky within a family and friend arena to try to help people with their problems. It doesn't work so well. And you can lose friends if you I don't bring my work home with me.
Mm.
I'm not I don't feel like a therapist with my family. I'm not. I'm as full of issues as any other human in a family. So I don't feel I'm any expert in my family. Besides, my husband is a psychoanalyst, and my son is a crack therapist in practice now. Really excellent. And I'm surrounded by this kind of talk and thought.
Yeah.
But we're respectful, you know.
So when you guys have conversations, it's more like on the educational line, if there are conversations, just about the field in general and not just like
Oh, we don't. We talk about their kids. We talk about what's going through their minds. We talk about what we're having for dinner. We chit chat. We talk
yeah.
like any family does. And if they need help with something, or if I need help with something, I might say, "Can I ask you a question?" And then my son, more than my daughter, because she's an architect. So she'll give me all kinds of, I mean, she's redone my house. I could show you. It's beautiful. But if I ask my son about something professional, then he'll just give me his advice, and I respect it a lot because he's really out there currently, and he's young, and he's young to me anyway, and so he'll give me his best thinking, and if he does the same, honestly, I think I ask him more questions than he asks me, but I will give him my best thinking. Um, we will talk to each other wholeheartedly, but it's not like a therapist. My
Yeah.
husband and I have a lot of therapist type talks because he's now retired. And if I'm working on a book right now on adult children, and he is the most amazing person to talk to about it because he has all this analytic training. So bouncing ideas with him is just this resource that's like 2 feet away, or he'll edit a chapter, and he's just a brilliant guy, and it's so wonderful, and he will not write something with me or let me give him credit ever, but he deserves credit all the time.
That's
In the
awesome.
last couple of books, when he was working, we didn't do this at all. When we had kids at home, we didn't talk about anything but the kids.
Mm.
And my kids never even knew I'd written, they knew I'd written books and things like that, but they didn't know I had any profile. I never talked to them about it. I mean, the dinner table was about them, really, or
Yeah.
about what we did that day.
It's also it's the humility too. You do strike me as someone who practices humility on a day to day.
If I think humility, I don't think there's anything better in life than humility. And if you don't have that, work on that first. And if you do have that, enjoy it, because that if you want to stay, there's so many moments in life when you can become arrogant and full of yourself. And when you do, you lose your intimacy with everything that matters, you know,
Mm.
because you're not better than anybody. You're certainly not better than your family, and it's a head trip, and it's just in the way, but it's so tempting. It's like one of the sirens of Odysseus, because we're all insecure and we all want to go. And that made me really good. And that book, or that amount of money, or that, show, or whatever. I've lived in a privileged world, very fortunately, and I've seen a lot of people shipwreck on losing their humility.
Mm.
And when you lose your humility, you kind of lose the things that matter most. So it's not worth it. You
Not
get to
worth
feel
it.
for a moment. It's like a drink, you know, you get high for the evening. or the month or the year, but you lose touch with something that's more valuable.
Totally. And like you do see that a lot, whether it's fame, power, those are just as intoxicating as any drug or
Really,
any
so
drug or substance. So you do see that a lot. Um, one thing I wanted to pivot on because the name of the podcast is Finding Purpose. And you know, what was you have such a powerful purpose in what you do through your literature and through your practice and just through all the work you do. Um, when did you decide, hey, this is going to be my purpose to have this impact and make
that's
changes in
a great
people's lives?
question. That's a great question, and I know the answer. Um, I, I've always been aware that I can find meaning and a sense of grace and satisfaction and happiness by really getting into the subjects I'm into. And the subjects I've really been into were theater when I was young. I wanted to teach theater to kids, which I did when I graduated, when I got my undergrad degree. And I loved that. I wanted to help them grow from, creative things and discover themselves, and that worked well. And then I was a Montessori teacher in early my late 20s, and so I loved that, and I found purpose in that because I have an ability to get into things. So that was not the issue. I knew that I could find purpose from getting into things and feeling devoted and helping people. Um, when I found this current purpose, I was 35 years old, and I was transitioning. No, I was younger than that. Sorry, I was 31 years old. I was transitioning, getting a master's in educational psychology because I was a Montessori teacher and I did theater and I wanted to do theater educationally, etc. But I went for my own treatment week with someone called Sharon Wegscheider Cruz, who was one of the forerunners of working with codependency and ACOA issues. And those 5 weeks, and she used psychodrama to treat people. And my life just changed. And I thought, this is the work. I not what I really thought is I need to be around this healing energy, this level of this healing energy all the time. So I think I'll do it professionally.
Hmm.
That's right. That's how I found I really needed the help. I really needed to be around the work. And I reasoned, being so codependent myself, that the way to be around it was to learn to do it for others. And then mercifully, I figured out how much help I needed. I knew I needed the help. I knew I needed this work, but my purpose and my own personal needs have coincided. And remember, I did marry another ACOA. So we needed to do a lot of work to deal with two lives that had been very affected through parental addiction. And what I can tell you is that doing that, because we've had the benefit of watching now 3 generations benefit. And we've also seen 3 generations not benefit with people we know in the same boat who did not do the work. Doing the work is what makes the difference. It will free your children and your grandchildren. It's not that you won't make mistakes. You will, but you will make fewer mistakes and you will raise healthier children and they will raise healthier children, or they'll have a good shot at it. And if you don't do the work, you will pass on the distorted thinking and the unresolved trauma and that dysregulation and the misinterpretation and the layering on of all your past into your present relationships. It will interfere with your partnering and your parenting, and you will pay the price.
Yeah.
Worse than you paying the price, your children will pay the price. So
Yeah.
worry about God, don't worry about any of it. Get help.
Wow. That's powerful. I could talk to you all afternoon. I don't want to take a lot more of your time, but I do want to end with one question is what guidance would you give to someone who is struggling to find their purpose?
Oh, that's easy. I think it's easy. I never looked for my purpose. I just, because I do believe in God, I do believe in, I don't, the God I believe in is not sitting in heaven somewhere disembodied. The God I believe in is more the Eastern concept of God that is laced into everything. I believe in guidance. I believe in the mystery of the world. I just look out at nature and I believe in God. And I believe in some intelligence that is laced into everything alive. So I have no trouble praying for guidance, um, and trusting that God will guide me. And I never thought I wanted to do God's purpose for me. That's the honest truth. And I've always had a feeling that I was here to help others. And that is where I feel grounded and where I feel I'm contributing to the world. I really think people need to feel they're contributing to the world in a deep and meaningful way and not just being here for selfish, superficial reasons. Because if you're like that, you'll just, that's what you'll get, you know?
I love
So
that.
I really looked for my purpose. I just took, I did what I did purposefully. And we were in this ashram, and I had two little children. Our babies were in that world. So we were meditating. We were doing Eastern philosophy, right? We were living
Mhm.
the philosophy. And I think, let me, if I'm going to get the word right, but it was sadhana. It is the, I saw raising my children, when I didn't work when they were children little. I took care of them. And that is the hardest thing. That's much harder than working. Um, but I saw it as my sadhana, and I saw it as God's work. And I saw me not as Tian with children. I did see that, but I saw me as their mother,
Hmm.
whose job it was to be their mother. And that if I didn't fulfill that, they were out of luck, because you can't job that one out. You can get help and support, but we are our children's mothers. And I saw that as purposeful, and I saw it as doing my work with devotion. So I would say, more than finding purpose, do what is in front of you with devotion and for
Mhm.
a higher purpose. And that will be your purpose. Because sometimes, I find a taxi driver, I talk to all the taxi drivers in Manhattan, and the ones with purpose are taxi drivers with purpose, leading great lives and raising great kids. So, and the ones who are, lawyers and successful sometimes have less purpose because they can't stand the work they do. And. So I think you find purpose where you are.
I love that. I love that. Dr. Tian Dayton, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I think I literally could talk to you all afternoon.
It's been
Um,
beautiful talking to you. I think you're doing your purpose and your work too, Adam, and it's beautiful. And I'm sure you're,
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I'm hopeful that, it reaches as many people and it motivates people to just, yeah, live their honest purpose, like you said. If anybody visit Dr. Tian Dayton, she's just amazing. www.tiandayton.com, or you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to connect. You could find any of her books on Amazon. And yeah, definitely
may I say one
awesome
more
literature
thing?
to dig into. Yeah, absolutely.
And if any therapists are listening and they want to do this work that I do, if you go to RTRS, no, sorry, RTR dash sociometrics.com, RTR dash sociometrics, SOCIOMETRICS.com, or if you go to tiandayton.com, click in the nav bar RTR sociometrics.com, and you will learn how to get a certificate in this kind of experiential work that Adam did, and that's where we met.
Yeah, absolutely. Or any therapist, contact me. I'll connect you with her for you to learn more as well.
Perfect.
Um, but I really, really appreciate your time. and it's a beautiful day. I hope you get a chance to enjoy outside, and I'm sure we'll continue a conversation.
I'm
Thank
sure
you.
we will, Adam. Okay.